Welcome to our panel discussion, I Can't Breathe, Teaching Black History and Anti-Racism Post-George Floyd. A conversation among Black faculty, African American Studies faculty, and Mississippi State University alumni about the crucial importance of teaching Black history, particularly in this moment of racial reckoning. Our discussion is brought to you by the African American Studies program here at Mississippi State University. I want to thank our guests for joining us remotely and everyone viewing our discussion out there in cyberspace. We are joined by three distinguished guests. Joining us first from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, we have Dr. Stephen Finley. Dr. Finley has a joint appointment to the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies and the program in African and African American Studies at Louisiana State University. Dr. Finley received his PhD in Religious Studies from Rice University in 2009, shortly after joining the faculty at LSU in 2008. Dr. Finley specializes in African American religion. His courses revolve around African American religious cultures, African American religious thought and theory, and method in the study of religion. His research expands upon these themes with an emphasis on African American religion and embodiment. He is the co-editor of the book, There is a Mystery, Esotericism, Gnosticism, and Mysticism in African American Religious Experience, which is currently under contract, and he is an associate editor for the Encyclopedia of African American Religious Cultures. We also have with us Mr. Eddie Washington, who is joining us from his home in Tullahoma, Tennessee. Mr. Washington is a member of the Black Alumni Association. He attended Mississippi State University shortly after the end of racial segregation that prohibited Black students from enrolling at the university until 1965. As part of that initial cadre of African American students at MSU, Mr. Washington blazed the path for other students of color as well as faculty here at MSU. Although there is still much work to do in the areas of diversity, Mississippi State has a nearly 20% African American student enrollment, which places MSU ahead of other SEC schools in the recruitment of African American students. As an institution, and more importantly, as people of color, we owe a debt of gratitude to Mr. Washington and to students like him who took on the courageous task of integration in the Deep South. Thank you, Mr. Washington, and thank you for joining us today. We also have with us my colleague in African American Studies, Dr. Lee Soares. Dr. Soares is an assistant professor of history and a faculty affiliate with the African American Studies program at MSU. Her research focuses on the history of Black politics, education, and the U.S. South. She has taught courses including early U.S. history, the history of social movements, and the history of African American women. Dr. Soares received her PhD from Northwestern University in 2019, and she spent a year as a postdoctoral fellow at Penn State University before joining MSU faculty in Starkville last summer. And I am Dr. Kiana Cutts. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling, Educational Psychology, and Foundations. I am also a faculty affiliate with African American Studies. So, welcome to everyone. Thank you all again for joining us today. Thank you all for joining us virtually and taking time out to have what I hope and know will be an amazing conversation about the importance of teaching Black history in this current moment and in all future moments. So I want to start with Mr. Washington. As professors, we try to live up to the legacy of you and others who made it possible for us to be here. Part of that legacy is the rich history of social activism that you and others were part of. Would you take a moment to talk to us about your experience as a student here at Mississippi State University in the late 60s and early 70s? What are some of the challenges you faced and what are some of the triumphs that you achieved?
Well, one of the things, I guess our biggest thing was to actually become true members of the university. We just didn't want to be there. We wanted to participate, we wanted to belong, we wanted to contribute. And to do those things, we had to become organized. So even though at one point there was only about 7 of us, we decided that, if we were organized, prioritize and keep our actions together, then we could make a difference there. And so what we tried to do is we basically made the Y our de facto headquarters, because we wanted our own place in a way instead of just a general student union. And so we mostly hung out in the Y. And we did a lot of activities around in terms of bringing on people like Hammer, Parliament Funkadelic. We've had Big Joe Williams. We just brought a lot of people in, which was kind of amazing for the amount of students we had that we were able to get these guys to come. But they were a lot of them just wanted to come participate, I guess, and come to Mississippi State because just to be there as part of their career. Because, like I said, there wasn't a lot of opportunities even for Black acts to come to those universities. So that's one of the things we did. We put on programs like in places like Cosesco, where we every Saturday in Kenya costumes on Saturday morning, up early, hung over and grabbed Cosesco to tutor students, high school students and elementary school students. So, and that helped us. That brought in quite a few students from that area of the state.
And I didn't ask you before you started speaking. I apologize. Can you remind us what were the years that you were at Mississippi State University?
Yeah, I was there from '67 through '73.
Okay. So also, just kind of focusing a little bit on the conversation regarding the engagement of Black history, was there any engagement of Black history on campus then? Like, were there professors who talked about Black history or who taught courses that were focused on Black history?
There were courses taught, and some professors, or one professor there who became the first university advisor to the Afro-American Plus organization, Dr. Waters Murphy. And he was in philosophy and religion. So kind of natural outgrowth of discussing, racial relations, Afro-American history, and that kind of stuff. So he was kind of a pioneer. And I don't know if you look back at the end of the Reveillés or something, you'll see him in the picture with us. So like I said, he was really a great. Well, he is a great person. And he basically, said, hey, if you want me in the meeting, let me know. If you want me to go somewhere else for a few minutes, let me know, So, but he basically let us run the show. So.
Thank you. And the noting that he was a philosophy and religion professor, that's a very good and natural segue into the questions that I have for you, Dr. Finley. So I want to go ahead and pose those questions for you. Your scholarship focuses on the intersection of race and religion, history, and then also theory in relation to African-American religious cultures. Could you talk a little bit about how your research engages the larger question that we're raising here? Specifically, that is, how can we marshal African-American history in this moment of crisis and opportunity where we are addressing the problem of police brutality, racial inequality, bigotry, and discrimination?
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Cutts, for that question. I apologize for the my tardiness and that I misunderstood. Let me first start by updating my bio, which is actually important for that question. I'm currently the director of the African and African American Studies program at Louisiana State, which the Board of Supervisors just voted to approve our proposal to become a department, and that was in December 10th. And thank you. The program started in 1994, and it's been a program for 26 and a half years. The only step left is for the Board of Regents to approve it, and that's usually rubber stamp. So that's really important to this context for this conversation. And then there are 3 books that are all under contract that are, again, related to African American history, race and religion, and so on. My book, In and Out of This World, Material and Extraterrestrial Bodies in the Nation of Islam, is under contract with Duke University Press. A book, Ivory Towers, Regulatory Technologies and the Reproduction of Anti-Black Violence in the Academy, Introducing Black Faculty Studies, is under contract with Johns Hopkins University Press. And the book, The Religion of White Rage, which is crucially important for making sense for what happened in the Capitol on January 6th, The Religion of White Rage, White Workers, Religious Fervor, and the Myth of Black Racial Progress, was published by Edinburgh University Press in October. So that's really important context for my work at LSU and my research as it relates to the subject and teaching Black history at LSU. Given that, let me just speak anecdotally for a moment. Given the importance of African American studies and the intersection of Black studies and race, LSU put together a committee, and this committee was proposing an anti-racist course, which would basically be a general education course that all students at LSU would have to take. The background of this is that students who are also athletes approached a member of the AAAS faculty and asked her if she would help them to come up with an initiative that would have this course, which is an introductory course, AAAS 2000, which is Intro to African American Studies, count as a general education requirement for all students. I was actually asked to be on this committee, even though I was a director. The initiative was actually started by students in response to the death of George Floyd and other anti-Black police violence. All right, so let me get to the meat of this. And I don't mind saying this because it's public. So in November, since it's a faculty matter, the faculty senate had to vote on this particular initiative. And if you don't mind me saying, it was a shit show. With respect to the need for all students, not just Black students, to study Black history and African American studies so that we can create better citizens, right? Because you can't tell me that those people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were dumb, backwoods rednecks. These were professionals, people who had gone to college, people who had been failed by the education system. And it's also clear to me that lots of them were professionals. Well, this was an anti-racist course, or at least it was framed that way. It was really just an introduction to African American life, African American studies, that as a general education course would be meant to help LSU create better citizens. Students and people who can then live in the world and understand it better. It was just a mess. I mean, I don't even know what to say. How does a school, in the context in which we now find ourselves, sociopolitically, not give more attention and consideration for the kind of course that would help people live in the world more fruitfully and live with others, right? Black studies is super important where that's concerned. But I think the point I want to make is that it's also important in these academies, in these university settings. And one of the things we found is that the metaphor ivory tower is a misnomer. Because it implies that what happens in university cultures is different and insulated and shielded somehow from what happens in the world. And what I'm suggesting is that's just not the case. The same reaction to, and this is what we argue in The Religion of White Rage, to this desire of Black people to want to live in a more just world, this desire or even the perception of desire for Black racial progress leads to what Martin Luther King Jr. and others have called the white backlash. What I call, because I wanted to expand the concept of backlash, white consolidation. And what I want to propose here is that what happened in January 6th is related to what happened in the Faculty Senate and the violent reaction from faculties, people with PhDs across disciplines who rejected, right, even though it never went to a vote, right? And that's part of the trick here too. We want to send it to committees. We want to argue that it's reverse racism, which some of the white faculty did, that these two things are related. That white consolidation in the world is also closely related to the response of Black faculty and our colleagues in the academy to us pushing Black studies and the relevance of it for everybody, not just Black students. And so that's anecdotal, but I just wanted to start there because I think it's an important conversation. And we are talking about, I can't read, right? The importance of Black history and teaching Black history and the resistance to this from educated college communities, right? All right, I'll stop there for now.
No, you're fine. You're actually saying a lot of what I was going to lead into with you, Dr. Soares. So these conversations are flowing very much from one to the next. Because I was going to ask you, Dr. Soares, a little bit about your work, and then in particular about centering Black voices and experiences and the controversy around the 1619 Project, and how that also connects to what you were saying, Dr. Finley, regarding white consolidation.
Thank you, Anna. I'm really glad to be here with you all. I'm enjoying, getting to meet you, Mr. Washington, and Dr. Finley as well. So my work as a historian, my research relates to some of this because my current book project on 19th century public Black colleges, I think, helps to show how the ongoing sort of disproportionate burden that HBCUs today face due to funding cuts and political indifference are sort of part of a much larger history of inequity in higher education, and relates a lot to a lot of what Dr. Finley was just saying. And as a teacher of African American history and also American history courses, I think it's absolutely crucial to center Black voices and Black experiences. So when I, have the opportunity, as I did in the fall, to teach early U.S. history, which is a gen ed, course that, every student at Mississippi State has to take, that's really my opportunity to center Black experiences as really kind of the core of American history, right? That not just to silo it in Black history courses, which are also, valuable, and I love to teach those as well, but to highlight Black voices and other marginalized groups in those general survey courses. And the way I do that is by choosing kind of, who I'm kind of shaping the narrative around, and bringing in, primary sources, but also thinking about whose ideas and whose scholarship my syllabus values. So thinking about who you're assigning, what textbooks you're using, what scholars you're citing. I think that's really important, and as well as one thing I really think is so much so important, especially in the wake of everything that's gone on in the past year, is to really kind of invite students to connect what they're learning about about history and to the present, and to kind of invite them to think about where they see historical narratives at work in the society around them, whether it's in film or in politics or in media. And I found that students are really excited to engage with history in that way, and to really try to make connections to the present. You brought up the 1619 Project, which I'm glad you did, because certainly for historians, the controversy that has surrounded that, has been the subject of much debate and reflection. I would just say that the idea that sort of 1776 or 1619, right? This idea of the start of U.S. history, right? It's already in so many ways arbitrary, right? It's, when I taught early U.S. history here in the fall, I started with indigenous North Americans thousands of years ago, right? So it's not really about the date, right? That's not actually what is so threatening, right? I think what the 1619 Project does that, threatens so many white conservatives and sort of is the reason that lawmakers are trying to penalize it or ban it, is because it frames the story of American nation building around questions of slavery, exploitation, dispossession. And so, I think regardless of when you start the story, right, those questions are essential, as well as, right, how marginalized communities struggled for freedom and equality sort of in the face of those things. And, there's a lot more I could say about the 1619 Project. I guess one thing I want to say about it is, the commission that the former president had to study this 1619 Project, that 1776 commission, the report that they just published a few weeks ago. One thing that seemed, there seems to be this kind of protective feeling around, preserving the importance of the Declaration of Independence, right? There was this sort of straw man argument that the 1619 Project was kind of denying the significance of the Revolutionary era and, documents like the Declaration of Independence. And, I just think that's complete hogwash. I mean, no one interested in centering Black historical voices could deny the importance of that era, because Black Americans themselves at the time understood the significance of that moment. Whether it's Phyllis Wheatley kind of using the Declaration as a way to call out American hypocrisy for, espousing these values at the same time that the new nation is expanding slavery, or whether it's, ordinary enslaved women like Elizabeth Freeman or the hundreds of other enslaved people who used those values as the basis of their lawsuits and petitions for emancipation during that era, right? They certainly understood the opportunities and the limitations of the Revolutionary era and of these sort of American values and ideals. And, right, I think regardless of where you start your idea of U.S. history, that tension is, important and central to the story of American history.
Absolutely. And I want to just kind of add to that a little bit. I know I'm moderating, but one of the things that came to mind as all of you were speaking, and definitely with you, Dr. Finley and Dr. Soares, is thinking about the resistance in terms of teaching history, specifically teaching Black history, and teaching in ways that is not ahistorical, and how, like you said, there was this protection about the actual 1776, like the protection about that date, but we also know that it was more than about just that date. One of the things that I'm in education, so I work primarily with teacher candidates, and we have been discussing recently this bill that's been proposed by Senator Angela Burks Hill. It's called the Saving American History in Mississippi Schools. And what it proposes is that funds will be no funds, no school funding can be used to teach any portion of the 1619 project, which, okay, that's one thing. But the flip side of that, the second part is if schools that do teach any portion of the 1619 project will have their funding cut by at least 25%. And so I wanted to, if you all could kind of talk a little bit, all three of you, about this resistance to teaching Black history, and not just with, I mean, I think the bill is directed towards the 1619 project, but of course it could be directed towards any endeavor where we're trying to center Black voices and have a more accurate representation of the full depth of the Black experience. So could you all speak to that a little bit?
Well, what I noticed is basically it's a fear of admitting the contribution made by Black people to history. I mean, really, there is no such thing as American history. Black history is American history. I mean, without Black people, there really wouldn't be America in terms of what we have now, because we have made so many contributions to so many things. The cotton gin. I mean, you just think about all the major things that have been done a lot of times by Black people, but we don't get the credit. And so, and that's I think it's a fear of them not being able to compete. That's what, I mean, and that's one of the biggest fear is that they think a lot of people have a feeling of inadequacy, that Black guys are, and when I mean Black guys, the whole, women and men, basically is that we have a skill that they don't really have, the ability to adapt, adjust, and survive. And so since they think they're going to lose to begin with, they're trying to even the playing field by holding us back. So and that's how I feel about it. That essentially they're afraid of competition, because ask yourself, why are they going through all these things other than fear of competing?
So I'd like to at first acknowledge what Mr. Washington just said, which is really important. And the word you used was centering Black voices, Dr. Cutts. And because I think what Mr. Washington said is related to that language. Philosopher George Yancey, in his book What White Looks Like, right? He's a famous philosopher. We probably all know him. He talks about whiteness as this invisible and unacknowledged center, right? And I want to understand what Yancey is talking about in terms of whiteness in religious terms. I mean, it's not just the work I do. Some scholars say that scholars are always trying to make work relevant to their discipline, and there's some truth to that. But I want to argue that whiteness actually is religious, that whiteness developed alongside the concept of religion and emerged in the modern age in relationship to it. And this is the argument of Charles Long, the late Charles Long, who died last year, in his book Significations, Signs, Symbols, and the Interpretation of Religion. And so for Long, religion it doesn't have necessarily to do with gods, nor creeds, nor institutions, and so on, not even necessarily belief. It has to do with orientation. What it means by orientation is how one comes to terms with the significance of one's place in the world. That's what he means by religion. And that happens first and foremost in this country through the lens and the experience of race. And this is why for Long, religion is a racial concept and a racial category, and race is a religious one. And those two are indissociable. In fact, they emerge together. And so when we talk about centering Black voices, it's easy for that to be read as decentering other voices or dominant voices. And this is where you get these often violent responses from white communities that are invested in what they see as both the desire for Black progress and to be heard, and for their voices to be centered, but also the twin notion of white loss. In other words, if that happens, then we're no longer centered, right? We're no longer at the center of everything cosmologically. I mean, race as a concept in America revolves around and makes its appearance around whiteness. And so, you know, we sometimes wonder why we get these violent responses, again, what I'm calling white consolidation, when we simply raise the issue of centering Black voices, like you suggest, and teaching, like Mr. Washington mentioned, Black history, and the accomplishments of African Americans. It all has to do with who is seen at the center and who has the right, and I mean by that, I mean the cosmic right to inhabit this center in the United States. And anytime there's any perceived threat to that, you get this reaction from, and it's not just conservatives, right? From white communities. And this is, you know, in the book, in my chapter in The Religion of White Rage, this is why I use the concept of white consolidation, because it's all sectors of even progressive. Look, in that faculty senate meeting that I was talking about, some of the people who spoke out against it the most, this proposal that AAAS be required for all students, were so-called progressive white people, not just conservatives, right? And so, you know, we don't have to wonder why, when we talk about teaching Black history or centering Black voices or requiring African-American studies for all students, why we get this kind of reaction. It's because it's more than economic, right? In fact, I would say economic is sort of a secondary concern. The primary concern is who by right, cosmologically, socially, and otherwise, gets to be at the center, right? And again, Yancey calls this unacknowledged center, right? This invisible and unacknowledged center. To acknowledge it means that we get to talk about it, and we might even need to do something about it. And so it functions through concealment, through these kinds of activities that push back on trying to center other voices, or trying to raise issues about white mythology, such as, you know, this mythology of white innocence and origins and beginnings that Dr. Soares, I hope I pronounced her name right, was pointing to in some of her comments. And so again, we have to be ready for this and be able to predict it, but we also have to be ready for the response. And all we want is a more just world, right, for all people. But in so doing, the response to us is often quite violent, both in the academy and outside the academy.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I want to add, you know, thinking back to your question, Dr. Cutts, about the law and the bill that is being kind of debated right now in Mississippi, that I think that the focus on schools, right, there's kind of should not be ignored, because we've seen in this country a long history of, right, using education, and I think in other countries as well, right, that using education as targeting that as a way to sort of reinscribe kind of white supremacy and other kind of oppressive elements. So when I hear about these bills being debated, or about, you know, using the, you know, trying to stamp out, you know, the teaching of Black history, you know, I can't help but think about, you know, white leaders, you know, in the antebellum South, right, passing laws against, you know, teaching enslaved people how to read or write, or the way that the KKK targeted schools, as well as, you know, other forms of Black property, but when, you know, to destroy. And you know, so I think that school, you know, we need to pay attention to what's going on in our schools, whether we, you know, have kids in them in the school systems or not. And it also, I think, speaks to the importance of the work that college level professors do, because that reminds me that when my students get to my class, if they've come from, public schools in Mississippi, which most of them do, they may not have encountered some of the stories and the history that I am, presenting to them. And that makes the work that we do all the more important. But what makes me nervous is also thinking about ways that, kind of assaults on higher education and this sort of silencing of folks working in sort of critical race studies and other kind of really important fields by, especially when they're working at public universities. We've seen that in Mississippi this year alone. So it's not like we're safe in higher ed, but we have an important role to play, I think.
Absolutely. I think just as you all were both speaking, one of the things that I thought about was contextualizing these conversations about education. And you brought up that the majority of the students in your classes and my classes as well, are from Mississippi, and so may not have had instruction or readings or what have your education centered around a lot of the topics that we're talking about. And Dr. Finley, I don't know, this might be your experience as well. So I wonder if both of you could kind of speak a little bit about the contextualization of teaching Black history, particularly as it relates to Louisiana and Mississippi, which are, the census data tell us Black people are mostly in about, I think, 9 or 10 states in the United States, and Mississippi and Louisiana are definitely two of those 9. So how important, or how might those experiences differ based on the Louisiana as well as the Mississippi context?
I'm not sure. You may have to clarify the question a little bit for me, because I'm not sure I quite understand.
Just wondering if you could speak a little bit about knowing the history of Black people in Louisiana. Mm-hmm. How might the teaching of Black history have maybe even more of an emphasis that is specific to the state?
Yes, and in Louisiana, the African-American population is something like 33-34%. The local population of LSU, East Baton Rouge Parish, is at least 51% Black. And so that's right. And so tying the importance of Black history and African American studies to these demographics is one of the strategies that we try to use to push the importance of this work in our particular situation. But we also emphasize, like I think you're suggesting, the importance and accomplishments of this particular setting, and I don't just mean slavery, right? But that's one of them, and the slave economy, and I mean, my house is built on a former sugar plantation where I live, right? And so part of what was important to me buying this house was to take back a little piece of this land for my ancestors, right? And so I mean, it's important to connect Black history and local Black history to its importance and to what we're teaching in our courses.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I am still learning. I think I have a lot more to learn about Mississippi State students and Mississippi as a new resident. But of course, like so many Black Americans, while I've never lived in Mississippi, I have roots in Mississippi. And when I told my family that I was taking a job here, they thought about that. We talked about that, about how, kind of incredible it was that my ancestors who came through Mississippi They came enslaved, and now I'm coming as a professor at public land grant college, right? So I think it's incredibly important to make history personal. It's I do it for myself, and I also think it's a way to access sort of student engagement as well. And I think when you think about teaching Black history in Mississippi, it's easy, like Dr. Finley just kind of joked a little bit, or said that it's easy to think about slavery, but it's so much more than that, like he was saying. And, I was struck hearing Mr. Washington talk about how, when he was on campus, the students invited Fannie Lou Hamer to come speak. And so to think, being in Mississippi and being, teaching Black history in Mississippi, yes, you're teaching about violence and slavery and Jim Crow, but you're also teaching about folks like Mr. Washington and his cohort who integrated schools here. You're, talking about the Fannie Lou Hamers and other, Black women in Mississippi. And their legacy is, it's wonderful to get to teach that. It's a lot easier to teach that in Mississippi than in some other states I've lived, where, where there's not as many, Black students or Black, roots. And so, there's definitely opportunities for using that kind of current kind of geographic context to enrich the way you teach American history.
Absolutely. I have two more questions, but one of them resonated with what you were just saying. And then also when you were speaking earlier, Mr. Washington, I thought about it as well, but just the incorporating or also thinking about Black love and Black joy in those aspects. And Dr. Soares, I know you had mentioned that a little bit, like how does that also need to be something that is centered in Black history? Because Mr. Washington, when you said, well, we brought Fannie Lou Hamer and then we also brought Parliament Funkadelic, I was like, yes, because Black people, we are going to do it all. We're going to have joy, regardless. So, and a lot of times the conversation about Black history, as you noted, is about those things that are in relation to the violence in those different areas. So how can we think more about centering Black love and Black joy as part of our Black history conversations?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what we had to learn to do, first of all, we had a philosophy, we were going to enjoy it, period. We were going to become part of the universe, and we were going to be part of that campus. We weren't going to hide, and we weren't didn't think that being Black was a disadvantage. I guess that's one thing that was unique about most of us that were at state at that time. I mean, it was, we were all extremely proud of being Black. But we didn't think Black was the only thing you could be. I mean, we like I said, one of our, big heroes was white guy. I mean, he was our advisor, and but he saw us as human beings. We saw him as a human being, and that's what's important, is just seeing others and treating others how you want to be treated and how you want to be seen. And so that was the big lesson we had, was that it's a lot easier to talk to someone when you got something that you share, and especially something that you are having fun at, really, and so that's why we centered a whole lot of things around. And one thing I didn't bring up, we had a vocal group there, and I think they may still be in existence, called the Black Voices. And
we still have the Black Voices.
Right. I mean, it was, and I mean, they were, it was an awesome choir, and And so, like I said, and we try to center stuff around the Black experience and just share it with everyone, because we knew that once people saw how we were living and how we wanted to contribute, then they got out of your way, you know. So just even though this other my lifetime best friend went to that other school up north called Old Miss, and they didn't have anything like we had, you know, and it was because basically they just went there and didn't participate, you know. So and eventually that changed, but like I said, we didn't have that issue. And it was really, it wasn't something we planned. I mean, you're a high school student coming out of high school. I mean, when I was coming to Mississippi State, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know we were going to find so many, and I said so many, it was like 10 or 15, but that had a similar philosophy about life, you know, and that was life was to be lived and enjoyed, and, you know, just be yourself and be true to who you wanted to be, and treat others like you wanted to be treated. You know, so that's how we did it.
This is why I like Christina Sharp's work so much, and Christina Sharp's In the Wake. She's not denying the problems that Black people have faced. She's not denying the violence that we've had to overcome. But what she's focusing on in that concept and in that space is Black care. How can we and how do we live in such a concept, in such a context? How do we create relationships? How do we support one another? In short, how we care. And this is how I want to see Black studies and the teaching of Black history in the first place. It's not necessarily divorced from its context, but its focus is on the flourishing of Black people who had to live regardless of and despite, you know, such and such. And this is what I think the majority of our classes actually focus on. How do Black people live? How do they love? How do they take something that was given to them one way and do something totally genius with it, to where you get hip hop, you get African-American fashion, right? That they might take something that was given to them and they totally blow it up and exaggerate it to where it becomes something totally unique, right? So they'll take a hat and they'll make it huge and bright colored. They'll take a jacket or a coat and they'll lengthen it and they'll make the color bright. I mean, this is African-American culture. I mean, this is the sine qua non of Black life, taking founded objects, taking things that were given to us, sometimes as a negative, the scraps, and making something beautiful out of it. I mean, and this is why sometimes hip hop is a really good metaphor for it. I mean, hip hop took something that was the end, right? The records, and turned these records themselves into instruments, right? In a way that had never been done before. And this is how I want to understand Black life. Now, everybody doesn't see Black life and Black history and African-American studies this way, but this is the way we see it. And this is the way we teach it, right? It's about what Black people do creatively, in particular in the US, to build these beautiful connections to the earth and to other people and to the cosmos, and in a way that doesn't negate anyone else, but centers and uplifts Black people and their own living and flourishing.
As you were talking, I was thinking hair, nails, you know, all of those things. And then also when you talked about hip hop, I was, you know, Dapper Dan and, you know, all of those ways that we take things and recreate or create. And then also I'm a poet. So a lot of times I theorize through poetry. And so Nikki Giovanni's poem, Nikki Rosa, came to mind. She starts off, you know, childhood is always just basically described as being a drag if you're Black. But then she ended with, you know, Black love is Black wealth. And basically, they'll probably talk about my hard childhood, but they'll never understand that I was happy all the while, because we're going to have that joy. So definitely share some more of those experiences. Dr. Soares, did you also want to provide a little bit of commentary on that? And I have one more question. I don't want to take up you all's full afternoon. I'm enjoying the conversation, so we can continue to talk, but I do want to keep us within the time frame that we stated we will be here. But Dr. Soares, I would love to hear a little bit about the work that you're doing regarding centering Black love and joy.
Well, I'm still experimenting with that. And so I was taking notes as you all were talking, writing down, Nikki, Rosa, these are things that sources that I'd love to incorporate into my classes. I think it's certainly there's more kind of readily available when you're teaching kind of more modern history, but I also have been trying to think about, how to make room for, Black pleasure and joy and love in, the earlier, 19th century and before. It's something I'm still working on, and but yeah, I enjoyed hearing your responses.
Thank you for that. So to the last question I want to ask, and then provide a little bit of time for everyone to have a final thought after we respond to this last question, is to kind of center it or bring it back to the conversation about Black history and anti-racism post George Floyd, post Breonna Taylor. I definitely want to make sure that I add, say her name as well, and so many others. How would you say, for you, thinking about teaching Black history and or anti-racism changed last year, or was it highlighted last year? Just how was that experience of the moment, the summer of 2020, really? How did that change your thinking, or what did you notice about the teaching of Black history as a response to all the social unrest that we were seeing?
If I may, for me, I'm not sure that it changed my teaching, and I'm not saying that's good or bad. Maybe it should change my teaching. It's something that I have to be, reflexive about and think about. But one of the things for which there is no register in academic life that I experienced, that I did try to register with my college, is the constant effect of all of these anti-Black police killings have on us as Black faculty. I think for me, it was 2012 when Trayvon Martin died. It got killed. Let me correct myself. I struggled with that. I struggled to focus on my work and to teach my classes and to get my things done. What happens when you have a succession of those kinds of murders of Black and brown men and women and children, and you are an African-American professor in the academy charged with teaching others and carrying out research? There isn't a register for that in the academy. You don't get hazard pay. There aren't spaces necessarily for respite. And so we really have to think really hard and creatively and in relationship with others, some who are in the academy, some who are not, about how to navigate that and the emotions and the anxiety and the stress of it all, and how then to engage our students. And again, it's something that I continue to think through. But you hardly get a breath before the next one happens, or the next two, to process it and to come to some kind of conclusion about what this is going to mean for how I teach, or would I like to change a particular class or method. I mean, I think that I've made small steps and small changes, But before I can process it all, here we go again. And again, I just want to emphasize that as a Black male in the academy, and in my college, there are only 3 or 4 of us who are tenure track. There's no register for this. And then there's no register for the way that the college then calls upon you, also in response to all of this, and them wanting to promote an outward-facing narrative about how good the academy is and how much it cares, which depletes us further. And so I don't mind being vulnerable. That's why I'm on leave right now. Right, I'm not teaching this semester, and it's from sheer exhaustion and chronic stress. Right. Maybe I'll have a chance to, once I get myself together and I actually rest and can get back to my work, to think about these classes that I'll be teaching when I come back in the fall. The class I'm going to teach is the religious thought of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. How's that for a class after this? I don't know if it's going to be different. I'll be thinking about it.
Thank you so much for that. And I don't want to stop the flow. I definitely want to make sure that everyone else jumps in, but I just wanted to say the acknowledgement of the anxiety and that there is no no register. I don't know if you saw it, but when you made the comment about the way that the university then tends to call on you, I kind of took a deep breath and leaned back, because I am tired. I enjoy the work that I do, but I am exhausted, and you are absolutely correct. There's no register for how do we care for ourselves and keep going when we don't have, literally going back to the title for this discussion, we don't have a moment to breathe before there's something else. Thank you. Dr. Soares?
Yeah, thank you. That resonated with me as well. And I have to also, acknowledge that the summer of 2020 and thinking about teaching last fall was compounded by the pandemic, which also disproportionately affected Black communities and kind of exposed not only, right, the kind of reckoning and reshaping that is needed in sort of the realm of policing and law, but also in healthcare, in employment, in education. The list goes on and on. So yes, I feel you, Dr. Cutts and Dr. Finley, right? It is exhausting. And not only for us, but also for our Black students, which, I was mindful of going into, joining Mississippi State last summer. And, I don't know that it changed too much kind of how I taught, although I tried to keep, compassion and flexibility and generosity, right, kind of front of mind. But I do want to shout out, this is a more minor thing, and is not a change that necessarily happened because of 2020, but has been brewing for a few years. But I do want to shout out sort of scholars of color who put together sort of guides around, readings or syllabi or, resources that made it easy for, a new professor trying to put together syllabi for the first time to borrow from. And one guide that I, in particular, kind of as I was teaching early U.S. history, that I was happy to be able to reach for was the one that Gabrielle Foreman and other scholars of color who study slavery put together. And they were just sort of reminding professors and teachers to think about language in more intentional ways, how we talk about slavery and enslaved people. And so that was one just sort of minor, I shouldn't say minor, but one change that I made was to be sort of more intentional about those words I was using when teaching the history of slavery and and consulting, those kinds of community sourced materials that scholars of color put together over the past few years.
Thank you for that. Mr. Washington, I know you don't not a teaching per se, but how would you say that your thoughts about Black history post 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, how did you start to think about Black history and anti-racism?
Well, you know, the George Floyd thing was just, like I said, I mean, I probably was very emotional there for a few months. I mean, really, I mean, just, I mean, a lot of times I would find myself, wanting to break down and cry, really, just thinking about what they did to him, and for what reason? None. I mean, just other than the fact that he was Black, and that, I mean, it would have been, I mean, he wasn't even trying to get in anybody's face or anything. It was just, it was, this guy wanted to show that he could dominate any Black person he wanted to. And the same thing with Brown Killer. I mean, you just don't show up and start shooting into somebody's house. And like I said, so what you had to do was just reach deep down inside and realize that even though these were two horrible events, they did lead to something good, because it basically, I think, brought up across to a lot of Black people and a lot of other minorities and a lot of disadvantaged people that, no one can take away from you what you really believe in yourself, and so, and that's where I looked at it. I mean, and I think that led to a lot of the backlash, as they say, of people not wanting, saying, "Oh my God, we're losing control of these people. We can't really, we can't scare them to death anymore." So, and I think and we just had to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. 2020 definitely was a year that will impact us in a lot of ways for a considerable amount of time. I also want to ask you all, do you have any final thoughts, next steps? What should we do now?
In terms of, we really got
to just exhale. That's what we should do.
Right. Exhale, but I mean, to solidify our a chance at making gains, we have got to become more willing to be flexible and keep our eyes open for the opportunities to advance our race and to advance America, just the justice in America. And so we just had, I mean, we can't afford to sit back and relax and say, hey, this is not going to happen. But at the same time, we kind of wanted to take, I think, like a Joe Biden approach, where you try, you be honest, you be straight up, and you let people know what your true goals are. Yeah, so that's what I think needs to happen.
Well, I agree with Mr. Washington. I'm going to be skeptical of Joe Biden until I see it, but I appreciate the sentiment. And I just want to add to what Mr. Washington said, which we've already talked about here, that somehow we have to find a way to prioritize self-care, and both in our private lives and as faculty. We don't talk about it a whole lot. I think we're talking about it more since the pandemic, because it's affecting a lot more people, right? But it's always been a matter for the concerns of Black faculty, both living in the academy and outside the academy. How do we navigate those structures while at the same time staying sane and caring for ourselves, and then being able to care for others and our students? And so part of the reason why I'm not teaching is just that. I needed to prioritize my own mental health, my own physical health, and to be a better person, professor, mentor, and so on. And that's something we have to do for ourselves, even while we have expectations of others, like, you know, governments and presidents and so on. So for me, that's where we start, or one of the places where we can start.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo that. Yeah, that seeking help and taking care of ourselves and each other is, yeah, the first next step. And given, you know, thinking about this panel happening during Black History Month, the other thing I would say we could do next is just continue having these kinds of conversations or thinking about Black history even after February ends. You know, continue to learn about you know, the people who came before us, like Mr. Washington. I'm really glad I had the opportunity to meet you tonight. And I hope, you know, all of Mississippi State students get to hear about you. Certainly my students will. So I think kind of continuing to celebrate Black history, especially in these predominantly white spaces, like Mississippi State or like LSU, right, will continue to you know, be our mission.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you all. I'm going to leave us with the focus on, you know, the next thing, and the first thing is caring for ourselves. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I have like 3 pages full of notes over here. And lots of check marks of people whose work I know, and some whose work I need to definitely get to know. So part of my next step is definitely going to be, as my mentor, Asa Hill, used to always tell me, do your homework. So my next step is going to be doing my homework, and I hope that all of us will continue to start with caring for ourselves. It is not self-indulgence. It is an act of preservation, and that is political warfare. Audre Lorde. So I will end us with a quote from Audre Lorde. And thank you all again for participating in this panel.